Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast for episode number 174. With Dr. Francis Lee Stevens. He's taught a variety of classes in psychology and neuroscience, and his research focuses on affective neuroscience applications to psychotherapy. Today, we'll dive deep into his new book, coming out this fall, Affective Neuroscience and Psychotherapy, a clinician's guide for working with emotions, and we'll explore how Dr. Stevens has taken the latest developments in affective neuroscience and applies these science-based interventions with a sequential approach for helping patients with psychological disorders. I'm Andrea Samadi, author and educator from Toronto, Canada, now in Arizona, and like many of you listening, have been fascinated with learning and understanding the science behind high-performance strategies that we can all use to improve our own productivity in our schools, sports, and workplace environments. My vision is to bring the experts to you to share their books, resources, and ideas to help you to implement their proven strategies, whether you're a teacher in the classroom, a parent, or in the corporate environment. The purpose of this podcast is to take the fear out of this new discipline that backs our learning with simple neuroscience to make it applicable for us to all use right away for immediate results. What I think is fascinating as we're exploring this topic together is that education is not the only field that can benefit from the understanding of simple neuroscience. And there are equivalent fields that seek to translate neuroscience findings, like to law or economics and social policy, bringing in research in behavior regulation, decision-making, reward, empathy, and moral reasoning. When I received an email from Dr. Stevens about his new book that he wrote to help patients with psychological disorders with science-based interventions, I was so interested in learning more. If American psychologist Dr. Daniel Amen, whose book, The End of Mental Illness, we reviewed on episode 128, believes that normal is a myth and that 51% of us will have a mental health issue in our lifetime, like post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, addiction, and eating disorder, just to name a few, then it's clear that it's more normal than not to have a mental health problem, and we must all pay attention to the first sign of any mental health issue for ourselves, but especially for our younger generations, since it's critical for children's success in school and life. Research shows that students who receive social, emotional, and health support achieve better academically, and mental health is not simply the absence of mental illness, but also encompasses wellness promotion, social, emotional, and behavioral health, and the ability to cope with life's challenges. Left unmet, mental health problems are linked to costly negative outcomes such as academic and behavior problems, dropping out, and delinquency. Mental and behavior health problems not only affect students' short-term classroom engagement, but also interfere with long-term development of positive relationships and work-related skills. I've designed my questions for Dr. Stevens so we can all think of how we could apply his research in our lives if we're working with students or children who might have experienced trauma to see how we can use our emotional awareness, emotional validation, self-compassion, and gain a deeper understanding of specific emotions like maybe anger. Let's meet Dr. Stevens and learn the emotional science behind the brain. Welcome, Dr. Stevens. Thank you so much for meeting with me today to dive deeper into your new book coming out this fall, Affective Neuroscience and Psychotherapy, a clinician's guide for working with emotions. I am thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you.
I'm really excited about it. This is a book that I've been thinking about and kind of working on, at least in my mind, for a long time. And I think it can be really a big paradigm change in terms of how we approach psychotherapy. So I'm really excited to get the word out about the book.
Oh, for sure. And I'm excited about the questions. I was actually reading your book over the weekend. But before we get to the questions, I've got to ask about your background. and what led you to working in the field of psychotherapy. But I've got to mention something I heard recently while, doing the research over the weekend. I listened to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast you did, and you did that last month. And I had to actually stop and listen to make sure I heard it right. Did you actually work as an improv comedian? And then I wonder, what did you take from that experience to bring into your work as a psychologist?
I was an improv comedian when I was getting my master's degree at the University of Albany, and that was kind of a weekend job. It was very fun. We traveled to different colleges and performed improv shows. And I do think that those skills I do apply those to psychotherapy. And if you know anything about improv comedy, it's always yes and. You never negate the person. You never say, oh, that's not a gun. You're not supposed to say that. You always add to the scene. You're amplifying. And so with therapy, you never want to kind of negate the client, negate their experience. You always want to kind of go with the flow, to listen too, right? So in improv comedy, they always say you want to get out of your head. You want to be there. You want to be listening. If you're trying to think about something funny to say, you're probably failing. So if you think about, okay, I'm going to do this to the patient. I'm going to help the client this way. You're probably not listening to what the client's telling you. And maybe you need to slow down and pay attention and just trust that, your natural skills and abilities as a therapist will come out in response to what the client needs. I don't have to say, oh, I've got this set thing that I have to do. That's super important.
Oh, got it. That's really interesting for sure. And I remember back in Toronto, we used to go to improv, and it was this place called Yuck Yucks. And then in my first book, I mentioned that it was actually where, now who was the comedian guy that did Dumber and Dumber? I forget.
Jim Carrey?
Yes, Jim Carrey. He actually started at the Yuck Yucks we used to go to back in Toronto. And then he took a lot of visualization that he used from his experience into his acting career. And it was how he, visualized his first check. So he took his experience from Yuck Yuck. So
yeah, I've taught a lot of psychology. And so just being able to be up there and not have a script really kind of helps me, because you never know where the class is going to go or the questions the student might ask. So to be open to all that and to try to kind of think through things on the spot and try to answer questions you may not be prepared for, it really preps you, that background.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. So getting to the questions that tie into your book, I saw that you mentioned that research supports the idea that for many people, psychotherapy remains ineffective, with little explanation as to why. And I've actually always wondered, why does talking about our problems solve them without changing your thinking? Because we could still have negative thoughts about whatever it is running through our head unless we change the emotion attached to it. So I like that you've got cognitive behavioral therapy in your background, but can you explain where previous forms of psychotherapy have failed and what you found to be missing, and how your book offers a new way forward through your research in affective neuroscience?
Sure. So this is really kind of the foundation of the book here. So you look at cognitive behavioral therapy. The basic theory is you change your thinking, that changes how you feel. And another paradigm, kind of the more psychodynamic therapy, is often you develop an insight, right, an understanding, and then that changes your behavior, how you feel. And there's little evidence, especially if you look at the neuroscience, that changing our thinking actually change how we feel. All right. It may change how we cope with emotions. So CBT is a very helpful modality of therapy to learn how to cope with emotions, how to manage symptoms, how to not personalize things. Has a lot of value in that sense, but it's not holistic in the sense, no one comes to me and says, hey, Lee, you really got to help me. My thinking is awful. No, they come to me and say, Lee, I feel like garbage. Can you help me with that? So really what we want to do is we want to target therapy more at the emotion, less at the thinking. They're all interrelated. They're all kind of part of the same thing. And, you definitely want to address thoughts on some level, but we need more interventions that are targeted towards emotion and changing emotion. And as we talk more, and in the book, we talk about things like affect reconsolidation, that actually to really change traumatic emotions, difficult feelings, you need to kind of pair that with opposite emotions as you activate emotion. So really, we need to kind of think about how we approach psychotherapy and look towards we're not just trying to manage the symptoms, we're actually trying to change the feelings themselves. And that's going to give us a different approach towards how we can cure people. And I think eventually increase the effect size and make psychotherapy a much kind of sounder and better science.
Definitely. When I think about it, and I would always talk about this process that I learned just to stop the thought, like say stop. I never really thought about the emotion behind the thought. It was just like this thing is bothering me. And then when you're doing certain things where you're not focused on your work, it comes back into your head. I'm still not addressing how that thought was making me feel, right? I'm missing the
Exactly.
link.
Yeah. So if you look at the science, it looks like probably an emotion or an experience is probably driving that thinking. So say like some anxiety, right? Maybe you're worried about something, right? And so we can do all these therapeutic interventions that are commonplace now, mindfulness, letting go of a rumination, cognitive reappraisal, to change that thought, to let go of it, to make it better. And that stuff is helpful, but it doesn't necessarily understand like, well, what's driving that thought? And if there's an anxious feeling or notion, I'm not good enough, or, I'm a failure, right? Some sort of deeper feeling there, then we want to address that for kind of long-term enduring, as Richard Lane would say, therapeutic change. We don't just want to manage the symptoms of like letting go of the thought, because, that'll help, but you may always have what's driving that thought there. And we want to try to change that itself.
Got it. Got it. And I think I asked this a little bit later, but it's relevant now. So let's just say I figure out, I've got this thing that's bothering me, and I dive deeper into the emotion behind it. And I see, does it help to go back to childhood and see, find the roots of why I'm thinking this way? Is that one of the ways that you're helping people solve it? How do we know?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's one of the kind of the psychodynamic approaches, right? You have to kind of go back to childhood and unlock those memories, and that changes things. And, I don't think you have to have some sort of prescription when you go back, but you do have to deal with your feelings, which is really hard. Emotions are difficult. I mean, that's why maybe sometimes we gravitate to more of these kind of cognitive approaches, because we're not dealing with these kind of icky emotions. And so maybe I tell my patients, like, you don't necessarily have to go back to childhood. If you have an emotion from childhood that's affecting you now, well, we got to deal with that emotion. That's causing a problem. So if you've got some sort of like, deep feeling that start from childhood, you feel worthless or you feel no good, we have to address that feeling. And it's going to be very difficult to address. It's very uncomfortable. It's not pleasant. We typically try to avoid it. We defend against it. But if we can, be kind to that feeling and work with it, then we can make some therapeutic change.
Got it. So, this weekend I was working on my questions for you, and my husband's out doing some work at his local sheriff's office here in Arizona. He does some work in his spare time. And so I'm at my desk, he comes home, and I'm always curious to hear what he sees in the field as it relates to mental health. And what he shares when he gets back is always eye-opening, especially if we've never dealt with someone who's struggling with mental health in a serious way. And I just shake my head because the stories are outrageous. For someone who works directly with people who struggle with mental health, and what have you seen with the outcome of treatment for someone getting better versus staying on the same path?
Yeah. So a couple things there. One thing is like, talk about your husband. One thing I've noticed is, all emotions are valid. They may not make sense. They may not be germane to the situation. They could be something left over from childhood, but they're all real. They're all within us. None of it is just like, the emotion itself is a problem. All the emotions are valuable. Now you're asking, well, what makes maybe the difference between some people that they get better, that overcome this, and some people that don't? And really, it has to do with our ability to be able to activate and manage and change that initial feeling. So there's a couple things there. There's the ability to kind of like be aware of it, recognize what that deeper feeling is. There is the ability to manage that feeling when it comes up. If it's too overwhelming, we're not going to want to activate that feeling. So we have to have some emotion regulation skills to help manage if deep feelings do come up. We do feel overwhelmed, that we're not going to kind of go back to drinking or become suicidal, right? We have to have confidence that whatever feeling we have, we'll be able to cope with that. And that really makes a difference between those that are able to kind of transform these feelings and those that just kind of stay stuck, just kind of avoiding their feelings.
Got it. So sometimes he goes back to the same location and sees the same people doing the same things and having the same problems. And a part of me just wonders, do people just give up on people that are having the same thing? Do you ever see someone and think, "Oh goodness, I can't help you. You're not going to change," or do you have hope for every single person? Like they're a, you
Maybe I'm
know.
idealistic. I probably fall on the end of the hope. I mean, you definitely see these patterns where it happens again and
Yeah.
again, but I always try to be curious and think beyond that.
Mm,
What's happening that I'm missing, right? Um, I always make the assumption that people aren't trying to ruin their lives. They're not trying to sabotage themselves. So what's getting in it? And I often find it's like maybe it's an unaddressed feeling. It's some sort of weird dynamic that keeps playing out in their life that they're not even kind of privy to. And if we can kind of take a step back, look at that and be curious about it and be willing to have those feelings, then we can start to say, oh, well, when this happens, I do this, which causes this. And then we get into the same fight every time.
right.
You see this in couples therapy all the time. They come in, they fight
Mhm.
about the same thing over and over again. Nothing ever gets better. So, a lot of times it's like, okay, let's slow down and pay attention to what's happening to us in the moment.
Got it. Got it. That makes sense. Well, looking at the table of contents of your book, I see part one, you talk about the science and you've got your argument for a new approach to therapy. And then part two, you've got the practice where you walk us through how we've got to cope with understanding our emotions. Can you just explain both parts of the book and how you've been intentional with how you introduce topics for us?
Yeah, great question. Well, I never wanted to write a book. This is not really something that interests me. It's a lot of work, it's time consuming, but I really wanted to put these ideas together and down on paper. And I thought, well, the most important thing here is like for clinicians to have some skills to be able to work with, to be able to change patient outcomes for the better. But I also wanted to say, like, and I studied neuroscience in my postdoc, and I wanted to explain, well, why is that? Why are we using this approach? Why is it better than, say, another approach? And so I wrote kind of the first section on the neuroscience, the affective neuroscience. So the science section is kind of more of the, nuts and bolts of it. May not interest all the readers. They may want to skip through that. The second section more of the practice and how do you put that into practice with a client, if you're a therapist, what can you use? And I tell people, try not to read the book cover to cover. Find what you need there, because although I lay it out sequentially, different patients might be in different processes, and you might be working with different emotions. You might have to kind of go to that emotion. And there's all these kind of notes in the book to kind of go back if you want to learn more about why desire causes that. We can look at the dopamine circuit and you can read about that. But if you just want to help the client, just go ahead with this for now. So it's a book you can really kind of come back to and kind of grow with. As you learn more, as you want to get more involved in the science, you can kind of go back to that first section and read through that. If you're just kind of looking at, okay, how do I help a patient with jealousy? Well, we can just go right to that section.
Got it. And I'm always thinking about how do we apply this to educators in the classroom, because that's a lot of our listeners or our teachers or people in the workplace that just want to have a look at this. And teachers are now having to have all these roles with dealing with children with trauma. How could a teacher use this, do you think?
Oh, yeah, there's a big push now for the social emotional learning.
Yeah.
There's more and more research that, if you're not doing well emotionally, it's hard for you to kind of engage in cognitive development
Right.
and develop those kind of parts of our brain that we typically associate with education. So we
Hmm.
want to address, our students' feelings. We want to address their concerns. And, if they are, say, overwhelmed with anxiety in the classroom, that we tend to that we help them manage that anxiety, work through it, go past it, so that they can then be in a position where they can come into that classroom and learn. uh, Teachers dealing with trauma, it's like, oh boy, like you've got kind of two caps now. Not only are you trying to teach the basic ABCs, but you're also trying to, be a social worker and help them find the right services. And so it's a lot, but I recommend that you always want to validate what they're going through, their feelings, and try to help them connect to the right resources to get these emotional issues resolved so they can kind of maybe engage more in the traditional kind of cognitive role of the classroom.
Definitely, and seeing how learning happens in the brain is helpful. Or would you have any of the chapters you can think that a teacher should look at off the
So if
top
you
of your
look
head?
at the brain, like, like very much like emotion is tied with learning. And I think we were talking at the beginning, it's like you had Bruce Perry on and you were saying, well, he made it seem so much fun. And I enjoyed that so much, right? So it's like when you're enjoying something, when you're invested in it, learning doesn't have to be something where you're sitting down and trying to memorize facts. That seems like a waste of time to me. It should be something where you're kind of excited about things, you're kind of opening up new ideas. And that really is an emotional process as much as it is a cognitive one.
Definitely. I remember like back to some of our earlier episodes, we had Mark Brackett on, and he wrote the book Permission to Feel. And, just talked about how, many of us have been raised to hide our emotions. So I like how you actually listed some of the emotions. And we talk about Jack Pansect on the podcast and some of the emotions in the brain that he talks about. But what should we all know about our emotions and how our brain processes them so we don't get stuck in life?
Yeah. So a good example here, and I always tell my clients about this, is kind of, Leslie Greenberg's research on secondary and primary emotions, which is like, sometimes, and I always do the same. This is why we have depression. Somebody's like, oh, I have depression. I need to take medication for it. It's like, no, probably if you're depressed, there's probably a problem there, something going on in your brain that you want to address. We don't just, it's very rare. I mean, I think there's certain genetics and certain, biological factors that can contribute to it, but we usually just don't feel depressed for no reason. So it's like, say someone dies, we're sad, right? We're going to be sad. There's nothing I can do about that. There's something I should do about that. That's a loss. We want to grieve that, right? But sometimes we're sad and we don't want to grieve that loss. We don't want to accept those feelings. We want to accept that death. So we push it down, but the feelings are pushing up. So if you see that, that's a state of dissonance right there. We're in conflict with ourselves, that we want to feel sad, but we don't want to let ourselves feel sad. And in that stuck state, we're going to have psychopathology. We're going to have depression, anxiety. And so we want to do, that's something I can fix, is we take the lid off that. If we can accept those feelings, allow ourselves to grieve, have those feelings, let them pass, no longer are we in that stuck state of depression. We're moving forward, and now there's space to grow. We're not in a negative feeling anymore. That's a secondary emotion. The primary emotion is sadness. That's natural. We're going to feel that. But a secondary emotion comes when we're in that stuck state, where that never changes. That's suffering. Study Buddhism. It goes on forever.
Wow, this is good, and this is deep. And could we just take this to like a practical example that we're dealing with every day? So, we get an emotional charge about something. Like, who knows what it is, but we're going through our day and then something happens. We're like, oh, that's just like, then you feel that anger. Can you explain how we've got to understand behind whatever we're feeling? And then maybe use Joseph Ledoux's work that you talk about with the reconsolidation of whatever we're feeling. How do we take this feeling? What do we do with it?
Great. Another great question here. And in the book, I tell this story about, I used to work at the VA with veterans, and a lot of them had road rage. It seemed like a common theme for these veterans. So they come to my office, and a lot of times like, you know what, I'm sorry, my anger got out of control. I got to stop it. I'll control my anger better last time. Let me get out of here. Someone cut out in front of them and they would just go into a rage and they want to drive that person off the road. And then they would feel bad about it afterwards. And they would just say, I'm sorry, it's my anger. But if I could kind of get them to sit down and be curious and be with their feelings, they had a lot to be angry about. They had gone to wars they didn't want to go to. They did things they didn't want to do, right? And so they were made to feel angry. They were put in situations that they had no power. And whenever you're in a situation like that, it's going to make you angry. So these veterans had a lot of anger. Now, what happened is someone would pull out in front of them. And if someone pulls out in front of you, like, it makes us all angry. No one likes that. But for the normal average person, they don't go into a rage. There's like, maybe they beep their horn or at the stop sign say, hey, be careful. You almost hit me there. Watch where you're driving. But these guys would go into a rage. They would go crazy. And what would happen is it would activate all these past feelings, all this past anger from things that happened in the past. And so they're in a rage. And so rightfully so, this rage, this anger makes sense. It's just not germane to the situation. It's just not about the little lady that pulled out in front of them. All right. It's about all their past anger. So if I get them to recognize, hey, this road rage, it's not about this person that pulled in front of you. You just got to, not get so upset about it. It's about all these past feelings, all this past anger you're not dealing with. And if we can allow ourselves to have that anger, accept it, be kind to it, and Eventually with anger, we want to work towards forgiveness. It kind of gets into a whole other section there. But to work with that, then we can reconsolidate that feeling. We can change it, and you're not stuck feeling that anger all the time. If you just kind of more traditional therapy mechanisms, like, okay, breathe deep, count to 10. All right, anger's gone. Good. Get back. But you're never dealing with the actual anger itself, which is really what's driving the problem. So they'll be able to manage it better, but they're still always going to be angry. And, I want my patients to have a full amelioration of symptoms, not to be able to manage it, but to not feel that anger and pain anymore.
I think it's pretty powerful when you can get to that root cause, because usually things that push our buttons today are not because of anything today. They're from like 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I tell them, if something really upsets you or really reactivates you, it's probably not about the current situation. It's probably about the past.
Right. Right. But people have to do a little bit of work to dig to figure that out. It's normally not right, like in their thought process, right? They're thinking, this thing is really
Yeah, I would say in general, we typically over attribute our feelings to external things and under attribute our feelings to internal things, which is how we feel inside, maybe emotions we've been carrying around from the past.
And how do you get people to dig into that? Is it just through when they come to see you? Do you give them homework or?
Well, I really encourage my patients to allow themselves to have the feeling. And if they can recognize, oh, here's the feeling, and there's no one out there bothering me. No one's stressing me out. No one is on my case, and I'm still upset. I'm still anxious. I'm still angry. Then they can start to take some ownership of that. Like, oh, maybe that's not about my boss, or maybe that's not about my wife that's giving me a hard time. Maybe that's actually something to do with me, and I need to kind of take a look at that and take some ownership of it. And when you do that, when you can take ownership of the feeling, well, now you've got control over it. If you're always blaming your boss, it's like, well, we can't change your boss. And so, well, now I'm stuck. What more can I do? I give up. But if we can say, well, a lot of that feeling might come from within you, maybe from feeling powerless in the past or what have you. Okay. Now we can fix that because that's within us. We have control over that.
Got it. And it takes kind of you having to stop and be mindful because we're so busy. Who has time? And normally,
yeah. Most people are like, oh, the traffic's the problem. My boss is the problem. And it's like, well, actually, wait, I'm stressed out every day. Maybe it's something to do with me.
Oh, this is good. This is good. So the next question covers brain network theory, and I love seeing that when I looked through your table of contents. And we cover it on episode 48 with the idea that with learning, we've got to be able to switch between the central executive network and the salience and the imagination to have those flashes of creativity with learning. So with what you talk about in your book, how do we learn to integrate our entire brain so that we can make better decisions by using our networks?
Yeah, great question here again. So, I think what's happening here is a lot of this psychopathology is like these brain networks in dissidence, right? So, you're feeling one thing, but you don't want to feel that. So you push it down. And so, your salience network, right? It's like saying, hey, you should be sad about this. But, your central executive network, like, well, I don't want to deal with this right now. Not a good time. So you push it down. So you have these kind of networks, brain areas that are kind of in dissidence. And we want to try to integrate that. One of the examples I would tell my students is like, say someone says, hey, you want to go out for some pizza and beer? And it's like, well, I got an exam tomorrow. Well, you're kind of stuck right there, right? So, you could kind of go out, but then you feel guilty, you're not studying, or you could stay in, but then you feel bad, you're missing out. And so neither way, there's a win, right? You're going to feel bad. But if you can kind of integrate the thoughts and the feelings, those two different networks, well, then you can start thinking, well, maybe I could go out tomorrow night, or you know what, this exam is really important for me, and I want to do this, and I'm really, I really want to do that. So that's really where my most valuable feeling lies. And so then we're not in as much conflict. So we want to try to be able to integrate our thoughts, our feelings, our full experience, whatever it is, and then we can resolve kind of the dissonance, the conflict that rests within the brain.
And that's a hard one, right? Because, like, when you're studying for something, you're in your central executive network. And then, like, when you talk about someone's coming for pizza, I was trying to think of a fun example. I was like, well, who could knock at my door that would get me to stop doing my work? And I was thinking of a famous actor that would be at the door. And I haven't seen a Matt Damon movie in 10 years. So I'm like, no, it's not Matt Damon. I was thinking maybe Philip Seymour Hoffman, if he was still around. If he knocked at my door, I'd go down and I'd go for coffee with Philip Seymour Hoffman. But that's my feeling brain, like I'd love to have a chat with him, but I got all this work to do. And so, how do we know, how do we control that thinking brain versus feeling brain with like a really good opportunity to go and do something? You have to be really steadfast with your goals. I'd like say, sorry, Philip Seymour Hoffman can't go for coffee today. I've got to prepare for this interview. Like, how do we
Yeah,
do
I would say
that?
you probably don't have as much control as you would like to have, right?
Mhm.
So in that example, like Philip Seymour Hoffman's coming, that's really exciting. I mean, this is a great opportunity. Like you're going to be excited about this, right? It's going to be hard to say, well, let me put my, let me put that aside and tell him I can't see him right now because I have to prepare for this interview. I mean, that's going to create that kind of natural dissonance that we talk about.
Mhm.
And this is where you see pathology developing, right? If you're, say, under the age of like 12 or 10, you're just going to go see Philip Seymour Hoffman. Like you're not going to think about homework at that point, right? You
Right.
don't have that kind of frontal cortex developed yet
Mhm.
to things. And those individuals, they don't have psychopathology. They're
Mhm.
happy, right? Now you get above age 12, and if you look at like Inside Out, it's a great example of this, the movie. But then you might say, well, you know what? I can't spend time with Philip Seymour Hoffman right now. I have to study. Well, you're going to be in conflict. And if you feel shame because it's like, you know what, I feel guilty or I feel shame that I shouldn't even get excited about Philip Seymour Hoffman when I know how important this interview is. Well, now you're pushing your feelings down even more. All right. It's going to cause more pathology and you're going to be in this state of dissonance. And maybe you'll get the interview done, but you won't enjoy it. You won't be
Mhm.
happy. And you're going to
Mhm.
be in this state of pathology.
Wow, that's good. That's really good. And so what's the best thing to do is to what would you do? You've got something really important, yet you feel that cognitive dissonance. Do you choose work first?
Oh, this is a great question, right? Because work's very important. So what do I
Mhm.
do? And I had to do a lot of this, and I was writing this book, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, it's a
Uh-huh.
beautiful day out, but I want to get this chapter written so I can meet my deadline, right?
Hmm.
So what I do is I acknowledge, oh, it's a beautiful day out. Oh, Philip Seymour Hoffman's here. Like I do have that feeling. Like,
Hmm.
I can't control that. Like that's how I feel. I tell you, you can't control your feelings. You can only control how you respond to your feelings, right? And I say,
Right.
okay, you know what? Like I'm not going to totally deny that feeling. I might say, Philip Seymour Hoffman, hey, can you meet me at noon?
Right.
Or, well, I'm going to work for a couple more hours. And I also recognize that I really want to write this book. I really want to get prepared for this interview. This is really important to me. I'm really excited about this. If I hadn't written this book, I wouldn't be here sitting to you and have this opportunity. And so I remind myself of all the valuable things that are going to come out of me, sitting down and kind of writing this chapter, even though maybe I'm missing a bit of sunshine out there. And when I do that, I get excited about writing. I get invested. And so I
Mhm.
enjoyed writing this book for the most part, and that made it doable. If it was a slog, I would probably be, trying to find something Seymour Hoffman and see if we go outside with me because it's a beautiful day out.
Right. Oh, that's a really good way of thinking about it because there's so much more to what you're doing that you can look past going and hanging out with somebody or enjoying the day. There's this other vision that you put your mind on that helps.
Yeah, and if it was Philip Seymour Hoffman, believe me, I would have shut my computer down and I would be out the door with him. And that's okay, right? Because that's something I'm really excited about. But if it's something that's less exciting, I got to remind myself that's like, okay, wait, I'm really invested in this. Has a lot of meaning towards me. And I'm going to, do this, even though maybe I have some of an inclination to run outside.
Oh, I like this. These are great answers. So we've actually covered Joseph Ledoux's concept of memory reconsolidation on one of the episodes, and you address in your book, you call it affect reconsolidation. Can you share what you've learned with your research and what strategies you offer with this idea to help people to overcome negative emotions associated with past trauma that could be impacting or damaging their life?
Yeah. So yeah, the term in the neuroscience literature is memory consolidation. What that means is whenever you activate a memory and you restore it, it's never the same memory. So it's interesting. We never have the same memory twice. So we're always remembering a memory. So I remember my child, but I'm actually remembering my childhood. I don't actually, not there. So if you look at like Elizabeth Loftus' work, memory can be very variable, right? And so this is interesting. It shows that we can kind of, our brain's liable, it can change. And so I use the term affect reconsolidation because we're really not trying to change your memory. And so you had a traumatic event. We're not trying to change, like, oh, that didn't happen. You know, that wouldn't be possible. You can't reconsolidate that memory to that degree either. We're trying to change the emotion. So that's why I call it affect reconsolidation. We're not trying to change the memory around that event. We're trying to change the emotional nature around that event. So instead of a traumatic event being something that I can't accept or deal with or handle, it's something that's like, okay, I accept this about me. I'm able to have those feelings. You know, maybe I can even start to learn and grow from it in some ways. And so what you do for that affect reconsolidation process is you activate that emotion, which is very uncomfortable, but you're activating that old emotion and then you're repairing it with another emotion. So say you grew up and, you know, you felt worthless, you know, no one ever valued me. My parents never paid enough attention to me. I feel worthless. You want to activate that feeling and then you want to pair it with a feeling of worth. So I do feel worthlessness. That does exist with me, but I also have another feeling, right? And I even say to my patients, well, you're coming to therapy. You know, that takes effort. That shows me you have at least some worth for yourself. We're pairing those two feelings together. And my patients will say, my brain hurts when I do this because you're pairing this like, okay, I have this unworth, but I also know I have worth. And then when you do that and you can rewrite the worth over the unworth, that changes. So then you don't have that activated feeling of unworthiness all the time. You're able to feel worthy about yourself as a whole. And that overcomes, say, that childhood trauma, that changes it, reconsolidates it.
So it's almost like, you know, I always thought before I started doing this work that our memories were like videotapes. You would just rewind and see the memory again.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which, so you're kind of saying that we go back and we edit. So we're doing a cut and then we're adding in a new emotion to the old emotion. And so now our memory changes
We're
of the
actually
trauma.
changing the old emotion. So when that event gets reactivated or whatever kind of circuit activates that kind of traumatic response, instead of responding with a traumatic feeling, we're responding with a feeling of acceptance or okay, or if it's unworth, worth, or if it's unlovableness, right? We're changing whatever that is. If it's fear, it's safety, you know, we're providing the opposite emotion.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I love that. Is there anything that's important that you think we've missed about your book that we haven't talked about yet? Have I missed something in these questions?
Oh, wow. We've gone over a lot. One thing, you know, is that distinction between internal and external, right? So when we talk about affect reconsolidation, these are internal emotions, but sometimes emotions are external. And we also, like, you know, maybe we're having difficulty with our family, and that might be a real emotion, you know, based on our real environment, and that would maybe involve a different type of treatment. So we might want to learn how to set boundaries, or, you know, how to use I statements with our spouse, right? So there can be other non-trauma based therapeutic strategies that can be available too, that people might want to use as well. That's also part of the book. Definitely, trauma is definitely something that needs to be addressed. A lot of patients have that, but not all patients do, and there's strategies for them too.
Got it. So just to sum up everything, your final thoughts, if someone's picking up your book, what do you want them to know and how do you want them to use it?
Yeah. Hey, I'm frustrated with psychotherapy. Either I'm a therapist or a client. It's not working for me. Why not? Let me pick up Lee's book and see if I can take a look at this from another angle and see what I've been missing.
Definitely. Dr. Stevens, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I've learned so much from flipping through your book.
Oh, that's great.
Well, specifically with the questions I pulled out, I definitely wanted to dive a little bit deeper into brain network theory and reconsolidation, and thinking about how we can use this in our classrooms if we're a teacher and if we're a parent, and we're just trying to understand our emotions better. And you dive into some of the emotions like anger and jealousy. These are all things that we deal with in the classroom with our students. And I just want to thank you so much for this. If anyone wants to learn more, they can go to your website. I'll put the link in the show notes. And I know you've got research on your website. Can you just share what studies you've got up on your website?
Sure. I've done a lot of research on this, both from kind of the emotional approach to therapy to some of the neuroscience. I just posted one recently, came out in the Journal of Neuropsychology, and it's about empathy and compassion and pro-social behavior and how we can use compassion to manage our empathy response to engage in pro-social behavior. And this is very important for any clinician that might be struggling with burnout or having trouble, managing all the stress they're going through. Is how do we provide that self-compassion, which allows us to have empathy, which can help us engage in pro-social behavior to either, be a good teacher or be a good therapist, to be good to other people, and it turns out if we don't have compassion for ourselves, if we can't be kind to our own feelings, it's very hard for us to have empathy and concern for other people.
Oh, that's interesting. For sure. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I'll put the links to everything in the show notes, and I appreciate the research you've done and for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah. Please reach out with any questions. I'm always happy to hear.